Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Ave Maria Press Professional Development Webinar Series. In this webinar, Dominic Aquila will reflect on 3 practical implications of incarnational humanism for parish ministry. My name is Erin Pierce. I am the Ministry Resources and Special Initiatives Manager at Ave Maria Press. Everyone in the audience is muted today, but you are able to ask questions. Questions can be sent to our presenter using the questions box here on the GoToWebinar panel, and I'll read as many of those as possible at the end of the presentation today. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you tomorrow via email. You can also find it on our website as well as on YouTube and Vimeo. With that, I would like to welcome and introduce our presenter today. Dominic A. Aquila is a professor of history and director of institutional effectiveness and assessment at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. He is also the author of The Church and the Age of Enlightenment, which is the 7th book in the Reclaiming Catholic History series published by Ave Maria Press. Dom, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and make you presenter.
Okay.
Okay.
You see it?
We see it. Yes, we do.
Terrific.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and let you take it from here.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. The topic is focuses on the Incarnation. This is the just on the verge of Christmas. We've been spending the last 3.5 weeks preparing for this event. And so I wanted to take one idea from my book that Erin just mentioned, The Church in the Age of Enlightenment. And I'll have more to say about that momentarily. But there's the implications of the Incarnation are profound for our time right now, and especially for those engaged in parish ministry at whatever level, whether you're a CCD coordinator, a pastoral assistant, a religious ed coordinator. The implications are profound, especially in this time that we're living, and I hope to demonstrate that to you. But I wanted to just lay out exactly what you can expect to achieve by attending and participating in this webinar. First of all, by the end, you'll be able to discuss the Incarnation in its foundational aspect for evangelizing the culture. There's much discussion today at every turn in the church for the need to evangelize the culture. And the Incarnation is the foundation for any kind of evangelization. The second is it's the foundation for a truly Christian environmentalism. Environmentalism is a movement that is sweeping across the globe right now. Policies being implemented. And I want to speak about it, environmentalism, from a Christian perspective. Again, grounded in the Incarnation as the event which renews God's commitment to creation. And I also want to talk about the Incarnation as the event that gives meaning and purpose to the idea of vocation and our work. And then finally, the implications of the Incarnation, and I think most obviously, have implication for energizing, directing and energizing the next phase of the pro-life movement in the United States, now that the Supreme Court has overturned Roe versus Wade. So let me begin by speaking about using a gospel passage to demonstrate what I mean by the incarnational humanism. So this is a quote here. This is part of the Gospel of St. John, chapter 6, and it's the section of John 6 that is just before the proclamation of the Eucharist. So I'm going to just read it. I have the important part of the quote on the PowerPoint. Let me read it from a little bit earlier than verses 12 and 13. So Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. The Jewish feast of Passover was near. When Jesus raised his eyes and saw that a large crowd was coming to him, he said to Philip, "Where can we buy enough food for them to eat?" Jesus said this to test him because he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 200 days' wages worth of food would not be enough for each of them to have a little bit. One of his disciples, Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what good are these for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people recline." Now there was a great deal of grass in that place, so the men reclined, about 5,000 in number. Then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed them to those who were reclining, and also as much as the fish as they wanted. When they had their fill, he said to the disciples, "Gather the fragments left over, so that nothing will be wasted." So they collected them and filled 12 wicker baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves that had been more than they could eat. Now, what is this? How does this relate to the question we're about to discuss today? Well, we see at the very beginning of this, Jesus is testing his disciples, and it's Andrew who comes forward and says, "Here I have something. We have a few loaves, a few fishes, but what good is this?" And then Jesus blesses them, offers them, and they multiply in this miracle of the loaves and fishes. And then at the very end, he says, "But now let's nothing go to waste." And here's what the essential aspect of incarnational humanism is all about. Incarnational humanism is that we bring what we can from the world, a world that was created as good. Uh, they are sanctified, they've been sacramentalized by Jesus in his coming in the incarnation. He then offers them to the Father, and a miracle happens, right? And so too at the end of the world, the entire world, as we contribute whatever we can to the building up of the kingdom, Jesus will take that, offer it to the Father, perfect it, and offer it to the Father, so that nothing in human existence in the world goes to waste. Uh, there's a famous quote by the biblical scholar N.T. Wright when he speaks about this kind of phenomenon. He doesn't call it incarnational humanism. That's a term that I'll show you in a second, was um, placed into our conversation by the great Jesuit John Courtney Murray. But this whole idea is that everything that we do, every work of love that we do, every meal that we cook, every painting that we paint, every detail of our work, everything good contributes to uh, the world that will be given to Christ, who perfects it and offers it to the Father. So the world means something. Now, this may seem pretty obvious, I think, to many practicing Catholics, that this incarnational sense of the world. But I'm going to show you through this PowerPoint in this discussion that what we might assume to be the case in this incarnational humanism is being challenged at every turn. And so let me move to that now. So what is incarnational humanism? As I said, uh, Father John Courtney Murray, who was a very famous theologian in the United States, he was at Vatican II. He contributed greatly to the discussion on religious freedom. He was also a political theorist in America. So his idea of the incarnational humanism, and just quoting some of the essential parts of it, is the Son of God, the Logos, eternal wisdom, entered human history, and through the extension of Christ's body, the church, he is still operating and present to us. So uh, why? Why did God decide to save, redeem the human race through the incarnation? This is a question that's been asked by theologians up and down the ages. Um, and the first great answer to this was by Bishop Saint Athanasius. Athanasius was his book called On the Incarnation. If anyone is interested in sort of the theological justification for the incarnation and why God chose to save and redeem the world through the incarnation, that's the place to start. Because Athanasius wrote this book and defended it with his very life. He was hounded by heretics. He was stood alone against most bishops in the world who were making the case for another view of Christ, where in the incarnation we believe, and it's in our creed, that God, the incarnation, Jesus came to earth as both God and man, fully God and fully man. There were many heresies that sought to um, de-emphasize one part of that and emphasize another. And Athanasius held fast to the dogma that eventually became the dogma of the church. So because this presentation is not essentially theological one, I'm just going to leave this discussion here. But I'm going to tell you that the amount of writing, great theological writing on the incarnation and why God decided for the incarnation for redemption is great and profound. Athanasius calls it the divine dilemma, given that the human race had fallen and was increasingly falling into greater and greater sin and disorder. How was God going to make an intervention to redeem his creation? That's what he means by the divine dilemma. Okay, so what is the effects of the incarnation? What happens is because Jesus, a God, becomes a person in human history. Uh, God created the world uh, as good. If you read the opening of Genesis, everything that God creates, one day at a time, he says, and God saw that it was good. Now, when Jesus, the Son of God, becomes a human person, it sort of doubles down on that idea of the goodness of creation. It's not just any longer a word spoken by God that brings creation into existence, but now a human being, the Word made flesh, comes into creation to just underscore the importance of this goodness. So in so doing, everything that Jesus did as a human being, when he walked, all of a sudden, walking, the goodness of walking, becomes a source of sanctification of the world, of transforming the world. So the goodness of walking is now sanctified by Jesus. When Jesus worked with Saint Joseph, he transformed work into something that sanctifies and renews the world. In short, Jesus assumed human nature to give us his divine nature and restore us as agents for the transformation of the world in all that we do. So this is theologians call this a rescue operation for humanity that had fallen into sin. It is also a regeneration, a reset. Again, a doubling down of what was originally good, now underscored by the presence of Jesus' humanity to assert once again that creation is good. And all that we do in imitation of Christ is an imitation of how we sanctify and transform the world. So uh, now I'm going to, having established what the incarnation is, and incarnational humanism, which I'll continue to develop, I want to now sort of pivot to why I wrote this book on the church in the age of enlightenment. Uh, it became very clear to me. I wanted to find the root of the preeminence of science. I think having all of us lived through the pandemic, one of the mantras that came out of that, and it was used across the board, was used by people, on the liberal side of the political spectrum, on the conservative side, is follow the science. How has science become so totalizing that becomes the measure for everything that we do? And what this brought me back to uh, the age of enlightenment, and I'll talk about exactly what enlightenment is in a moment, where science reaches its preeminence as a totalizing cultural and social force. Uh, Now, before I pivoted all the way back to the Enlightenment, which in the book it covers the period from 1648 to 1848. Many historians of this period called the Enlightenment will have slightly different dates. I chose those dates because of a pivotal event that happened in 1648, which was the end of the 30 Years' War, a war that ravaged Europe. But I was very curious. This uh, the assertion that John Courtney Murray was making about an incarnational humanism. He wrote in the 1950s, and uh, why was it so necessary to advance that idea, particularly in the 1950s? Isn't it the case that we often look back, the culture looks back, maybe not so much now, but certainly when I was coming of age in the 1970s and 1980s, the 1950s were looked on as a period of with great nostalgia about how everything was well ordered in America. Everybody was happy. The show some people might remember called Happy Days was the celebration of the good times uh, of the 1950s. But yet, it's not only John Courtney Murray, but the great Fulton J. Sheehan. During the 1950s, and I have the dates here from 52 to 57, he had a television show called Life is Worth Living. And this show was enormously popular. Now, it was at the very beginning of the age of television. But Fulton Sheen was gaining a greater audience in the 1950s than a man named Milton Berle, who was called Mr. Television at the time. And what was so attractive about this? Because Fulton Sheen was not celebrating in the 1950s what we would consider a kind of nostalgic view of the 50s. Rather, he was addressing something that was profoundly sad. In the beginning of his first television broadcast, he talks about why is modern man in effect so depressed? Why is he find that life is not worth living? Uh, and in one of his broadcasts, and by the way, these broadcasts, you can still see them. They're on YouTube, many of them. They were compiled into a book called Life is Worth Living. And he said, there's a great sadness in America in the 1950s that people run away from by various seeking of pleasure. Whatever it is, entertainment or alcohol or whatever, constant pleasure seeking. And he said because the profound sadness is that modern man is afraid of being thrown back into nothingness from which he came, and he calls it a dread of nothingness. Now, the dread of nothingness that Fulton Sheen was talking about in the 1950s, at the age of when the United States had prevailed against two ideological superpowers, had beaten the Nazis with the help of allies. The economy was booming, everything great, but there was this dread of nothingness. Well, if that was the case in the 1950s, where the promise of progress scientific, technological progress was supposed to make everyone happy, and it failed to do that. Okay, that was my link back to the Enlightenment. When did this promise that was so celebrated in the 1950s about technology, science, invention, gadgets, these things that are going to make us happy, where did they come from? And that's what drew me back to the origins of that way of thinking uh, in the Enlightenment period back to 1648 and the 1700s and early 1800s. Well, if this idea of the dread of nothingness was so profound in the 1950s when everything was supposed to be so happy, what is it like today in the year 2022? The dread of uh, of nothingness that Fulton Sheen talks about is now a kind of eager embrace of nothingness. And here's what I mean. Let's just look around for, okay, there we go. These are just some of the items that I pulled up from contemporary movements uh, that not only dread nothingness, but embrace it. Maybe some of you have heard about this organization, the Voluntary Human Extinction Movement. It's been around a while, but lately it's been getting a lot of press. It has its own website. And the whole purpose of this movement is that it encourages people to voluntarily not have children, right? Not continue the human species. And eventually, human species will become extinct. And why? Because this will benefit the environment. The environment without human beings will restore a healthy biosphere. And as I said, this is a movement that is gaining great popularity. Then recently, and this keeps changing year after year, it becomes more and more, I think, scary. Uh, Canada has what's famously called its MAID, Medical Assistance in Dying Law, by which you can apply, with just getting the right certifications, which doesn't take very much, to voluntarily end your life. And it originally, and I'm not sure where this stands right now, you had to show that you were of sound mind in order to make this condition. And it seems to me that this last condition has been removed. And so this is one of these, embrace of nothingness, the dread of nothingness to go out of existence. Uh, then this third bullet here that now suicide is the second leading cause of death among people aged 15 to 24 in the US. And this statistic is as recently as March 2022. Uh, then there's underlying these developments, there is a heresy called Gnosticism. And again, this is one of those deeply theological issues, but it has made its appearance throughout human history, especially in Europe and America, from the earliest times of Christianity. And Gnosticism can be, in the context of what I'm talking about, can be summed up in this way. It is a contempt for the world in this sense, is that um, we are born into a world which we did not agree to be born into, and we are kind of flung here. Uh, and we are born into a network of relationships that are not happy relationships. They're the cause of constant anxiety, and therefore we find that the entire universe, our social relations, are completely out of tune with the deepest longings of the human heart. And this perennial heresy of Gnosticism sees the world as basically evil. Evil insofar as it's not attuned to what human beings want the most. Now, there's something interesting and good about that, right? It means at least it recognizes that the human heart is full of desire for something great. right? And you can't find it in the world. The Gnostic answer to this from throughout centuries has been death, has been an embrace of death, an embrace of not, for example, having children. And this has been going on a long time. And then my final example, and this goes back to Father Murray's discussion of incarnational humanism. What he distinguishes, and he's talking about two Christian traditions now. These are Christian traditions, both that have validity to them. The incarnational one, and now an eschatological humanism. But what he means by this is and it's very interesting. The title of the essay in which he discusses these two forms of humanism is called "Is It Basket Weaving?" And the reference is especially to those who embrace an eschatological humanism, that the world, yeah, sure, the world was created good, but at every turn, it seems to want to subvert and undermine our attempts to be sinless, to be holy. And so this is a story that is probably apocryphal, but that people, the best that they should do uh, is sit and weave baskets and not engage the world, because every engagement with the world, even though it's good, is an occasion for sin because of its fallenness. And so key to this eschatological humanism is a divorce from the world by Christians, uh, and then at the eschaton, or the end of times, what will happen is God will take the world and essentially throw it away, and a brand new world will be created. Now, and here's the big difference between an eschatological humanism and the incarnational humanism. In the eschatological humanism, where God just discards the world that we've been living in, all right, and creates something brand new for us to live in eternity. The incarnational one says, no, that's not what God's going to do. God is not going to take this world and throw it in the dustbin, but rather he's going to take this world, um, perfect it through Christ, and then offer it up, and it will to the Father, and the Father will build upon the work that human beings have done and make it better. So that's why I started with that passage from the Gospel of John, right, where Andrew says, here's human elements, pieces of bread, fish that has been caught. We offer it, and then it's finally given out to everyone. There's a miracle, and let nothing go to waste. And that is the essence of this incarnational humanism um, that will occur at the eschaton at the end, is that nothing we do in the world will go to waste, no matter what we tried, no matter what good things we did across all of creation. These will be preserved and perfected. So no good thing will be lost. Nothing gets dumped on into the dustbin. Now, this is a little detour into my work with the Enlightenment, and how the Enlightenment kind of spawned this this promise of a great society built upon science and its handmade technology and the cult of continuous progress. This is exactly the world that Fulton Sheen was talking about in the 1950s. We were all supposed to be very happy because of the advances in progress, a continuous progress. And Sheen notes this in his very first his first broadcast. He says, we're all enamored with progress, but he says, progress towards what? The goal of human progress seems to constantly be changing. Now, what I found in the Enlightenment is the root of this kind of thinking is that the men and women of the Enlightenment, and they were mostly thinkers, they were mostly people who advanced ideas, and those ideas have eventually became realized and became very attractive because many of them worked. The scientific worldview did achieve what many in the Enlightenment said kind of their noble aim, to make life a little better for everyone through science and its handmade technology. Now, who could argue with that, right? what gets lost in the process is, I think, what Fulton Sheen begins talking about in the 1950s. And I want to say that every pope who has written in the 20th century about the problems of a technological society, particularly Pope John Paul II, uh, Benedict XVI, has always given due credit to what the Enlightenment science has achieved, but then also gives the downside. Now, uh, the let me tell you what the Enlightenment is. Right? It's defined differently by different people. What I have taken it to be in my book is that there's a certain confidence in human beings living in the 17th century, that confidence in the ability of science to dominate creation, to be able to, as one Enlightenment thinker put it, to torture nature for her secrets. Then these ideas were floating around, but they became very powerful, and they became implemented in policies, in politics, in society, in Western Europe and in America. In fact, America is is often called the child of the Enlightenment. You know, it's called an empire of this kind of scientific reason. Um, but it also went with that, uh, among the Enlightenment thinkers, is that the past tradition, especially Christianity, especially the Catholic Church, had nothing to offer humanity that was of any use. Now, the event that gave the Enlightenment ideas this kind of purchase was, as I mentioned earlier, the 30 Years' War that devastated Europe. Before World War I, it was called the Great War. It was so devastating. Uh, Now, the Enlightenment ultimately fails to achieve its aim because, while there's technological advances, what it has done to the human spirit is quite damaging, as Fulton Sheen pointed out. And there's one paradox of the Enlightenment. There are many paradoxes of the Enlightenment, and a paradox means, sort of contradictions that are built into an idea. As I said, the Enlightenment rejected history, rejected tradition, rejected the past, um, and saw that these had nothing to offer humanity in the modern age. But yet, it's the very recourse to history, the use of history, especially by biblical scholars, to undermine the historical reality of the Incarnation. For example, the PBS documentary From Jesus to Christ, the First Christians, uses this kind of historical critical method that was honed in the Enlightenment to undermine and cast doubt on the Incarnation, where God becomes man and fleshed. God becomes enfleshed. Then there's the Jesus Seminar, which was a group of scholars that basically um, voted on those elements of the gospel which Jesus really said and which he didn't. And that's a whole other discussion. But that continued to cast doubt using historical critical methods to undermine the gospel. The History Channel, of all places, specialized in sensationalist exposés about the real truth about the historical Jesus. Okay, so let's move to some of the practical implications of what the Incarnation rightly understood, this incarnational humanism, that by what we do in the world matters and will matter into eternity. I first proposed the evangelization of culture. One of the things that the church, and I cover this in my book uh, quite extensively, the church indirectly, and then the church's mission as the extension of the body of Christ in time is to preach the gospel, right? It's to bring the good news to every quarter of the earth. But a byproduct of that has been at every stage the rejuvenation of culture. Uh, and there, we talk about the Renaissance, which occurred, historians say it occurred in Italy in the 1400s. Well, by my calculation, there's not one Renaissance, but many Renaissances inspired by Catholicism and this idea of incarnational humanism. Now there's the Anglo-Irish Renaissance, which again was, it started with the evangelization of a pagan people in Britain and Ireland by Benedictine monks. It took a long time for it to happen. And eventually they founded many monasteries. And they also, a byproduct of that was the enrichment of culture. Um, the Lindisfarne Gospels, which are beautifully uh, um, beautifully drawn, I mean, and preserved. Great historian, St. Bede at this time. The great Beowulf novel comes out of this Renaissance. The next one is the Carolingian Renaissance in France, where Charlemagne decides to unify Christendom through, or helping to centralize, or not centralize, but rather help organize, streamline things like liturgy, the Catholic teaching, and Charlemagne brings to his court men from all over Europe who will, in effect, rejuvenate the culture. Again, not that wasn't the intent. It was a byproduct of the church and the gospel. There's another Renaissance further to the east in Germany under the emperors Otto the First, Second, and Third. A 12th century Renaissance that was brought in by the Dominicans, St. Albert the Great. Um, and then finally, the Italian Renaissance of the 1400s. And what each of these Renaissances have in common is that the primary emphasis was the spreading of the gospel, right? The good news of Jesus becoming, the God becoming human being in the incarnation, and through that, the gospel that he preached spread to the world. And the byproduct was a cultural rejuvenation. Uh, in each one of these, because today we talk a lot about multiculturalism, the plurality of cultures. Each of these renaissances involved the bringing together of cultures and unifying them, not in a kind of domineering way, but in a natural way, so that the variety of cultures be integrated into something new and very human. Uh, the incarnation is also the basis for a truly Christian environmentalism. And I think this is here where we have to push back in our ministry and parishes and our teaching, and especially in teaching in CCD, adult education. The the environmental movement that began in the 70s um, really heaped a lot of blame on the Judeo-Christian tradition for the abuses of the environment, and they centered on uh, in Genesis, where God gave dominion of creation to humankind. And it's a profound misunderstanding of what was meant in Genesis uh, by dominion. Um, Human beings were not there to dominate nature in the sense that the Enlightenment did, in fact, do, to torture nature for her secrets. No, it was the idea of a Christian, Judeo-Christian understanding of the environment is that we are caretakers of it. Now, to be sure, after the fall, the first human sin, creation as well as human being falls. You know, when St. Paul says all creation groans because it needs restoration. Well, when the incarnation occurred, it's not just that human beings were restored and redeemed so that salvation was open to us, but all of creation that goes with us is being restored, right? So that's what, at the end of the world, this kind of a restored creation is given. Jesus takes it, perfects it, gives it to the Father. The right understanding of creation, the restoration, is humankind leading creation in a kind of liturgy of right praise of God. The unfolding of the Genesis story is like a liturgy, right? One event happening after the other, and the final event, the creation of humankind, as the most important element of that creation, to rightly order creation to praise of God. The other important implications of the incarnation, rightly understood, is it gives a kind of new energy and purpose to our vocation. Now, Vatican II did a great deal to recover the ideal of vocation. That is, what is our meaning and purpose in life? To find exactly what we're supposed to be doing at any given moment of our life in line with God's will for us. Now, Vatican II, that had always been part of Christianity. It sort of fell into disuse in Catholicism for a long time. But the incarnation has greater implications for vocation other than our personal salvation. In other words, doing the work we need to do, following the will of God so that we become holy and sanctified. Vocation is the work that we do is also to build up the kingdom of God. As I said at the beginning, quoting N.T. Wright, every meal we cook, every piece of music that's written, every patient that is cured, every piece of research that is done is to build up the kingdom. It's not just we find a vocation for our own personal holiness. That's an idea that was prominent among Calvinism, especially in America in the 1600s. But incarnation gives purpose. You know, when Jesus worked with his father in the workshop with St. Joseph, he dignified work in a whole new way. And now, this is the final point about the implications, and perhaps this is the most dramatic and the most important. Remember, I talked about this movement called Gnosticism. It's perennial. It exists from the beginning of Christianity and manifests itself in different ways at different times. It is basically that human beings have a decision to make. We are faced with the world that we are born into, and how do we adjust to it? We have this infinite longing in our hearts for infinity, for something greater. And because the universe of the world is an answer to that, do we destroy the universe? Do we destroy ourselves? Or do we actually adopt an attitude of gratitude for being born into this and the ability to make it into, over the course of generations, something that harmonizes with the greatest desires of the human heart? I quote here one prominent Gnostic writer of the 20th century. And here his particular attack was on the reproduction, about pregnant women. Why? Why would we want to recreate? He said, why does the good of multiplying monsters? And he thought of human beings as monsters in as much as that we don't belong in this world, right? We're uncomfortable in this world. We're not suited for this world. It is just this place where it's going to oppress us. Why bring into a doomed world one child after the next? Pregnant women, Chiorin predicted, will someday be stoned to death. The maternal instinct prescribed, sterility acclaimed. It's chilling. Do not we hear echoes of this in our culture? I want to juxtapose that against another writer, not Christian, she's Jewish, a very famous philosopher of the 20th century, Hannah Arendt, um, where she spoke exactly the opposite way. She said, and here she's speaking about the miracle of birth. She calls this whole idea natality. You might want to notice, especially as we're moving toward Christmas, beginning with December 17th, the first day of the so-called O antiphons. Today, for example, was the O antiphon, O Key of David. Um, that the gospel readings, the Old Testament readings, are all about natality, about birth, right? New beginnings. Hannah Arendt said this in her famous book called The Human Condition. She said, the miracle that saves the world, the realm of human affairs, from its normal, natural ruin, is ultimately that fact of natality, the birth of new men and the new beginning, the action they are capable of by virtue of being born. Only the full experience of this capacity can bestow upon human affairs faith and hope. those two essential characteristics of human existence. It is faith in and hope for the world that found its most glorious and most succinct expression in the few words with which the gospel announced their glad tidings. A child has been born to us. So here is Hannah Arendt, a Jewish woman, but basically secularized, pointing to the incarnation as the epitome of natality, of being born into a world that gives the world hope. It is so drastically different from the Gnostic element that we read in the previous slide by Chiori. And then finally, I would say this: what does St. Paul say about all this in the incarnation? How are we to live in this world where we can help create the kingdom, a kingdom that will not be thrown into at the end of the world? He says this is his approach to the world. Rejoice in the Lord always. I shall say it again, rejoice. Have no anxiety at all, but in everything, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, make your requests known to God. Then the peace of God that surpasses all understanding will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. And here is the advice of how to live. Whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is gracious, if there is any excellence, and if there be anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Think about these things. If the Enlightenment was about ideas, uh, St. Paul, way before the Enlightenment, celebrates the power of ideas and how, in order for us to realize this incarnational humanism, we must have the renewal of our minds in Christ Jesus. Thank you. Any questions, I'd be happy to take.
Okay, thank you so much, Dom. And as he mentioned, we welcome you to submit any questions that you have for him with the using the questions panel. So you gave us a lot of things to think about, to reflect on. And I wondered if you could just maybe add or share a little bit more. You talked about how at one time there was the dread of nothingness,
Mhm,
right? And now in 2022, it's like an embrace, we embrace nothingness. Can you
mhm.
tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I see in these movements that are developing, particularly this one of the for the voluntary extinction of humanity. It's not just what Fulton Sheen was speaking about was we dread this falling, and what is sin but a falling into non-being? We dread it, right? So we distract ourselves. We go to the movies. We do a lot of good things, right? But it's a distraction from that dread. Now what we see more and more is, yes, there's still the entertainment to distract us from that, but then there's also this powerful movement to not dread it but embrace it. And the environmental movement, which has taken on such enormity in Western Europe and America, celebrates this. It's like that human beings are the cause of the environmental catastrophes we have, and the best thing we do is get rid of ourselves. And so
Mhm.
it's gone from dread to an embrace, and say, and environmental movement has given us a cause to do it, right? To say, if you kill yourself or if you stop reproducing, then you're going to have a good thing happen, the environment. Question is, who's going to be there to enjoy it?
Right, exactly. Okay, I get that. All right. So I was also curious as you were talking about the preeminence of science, right? And there's this, seems like this thought that science and faith are incompatible,
Mhm.
right? Um, what would you say to someone today who thought that or proposed that idea?
Yeah, so, Aaron, thank you for that question, because it's one of the kind of cultural givens in our society, um, that science and religion are opposite, right? That they're at odds with one another. Now, there are many, many, many good people who have an apostolate, a ministry, to make sure that this division, this opposition, is sort of rejected. Because if you look, the Catholic Church was a prominent sponsor of science. Science comes out of the church's patronage of scientists. I'm thinking, one of the renaissances that I mentioned, the 12th century, the St. Albert the Great, he was a scientist of great preeminence. Many of Leonardo da Vinci, who was also inspired by a Catholic priest, Father Vicino. His science was so well integrated with everything he did, his art, his explorations, his inventions. So science and religion, this kind of false dichotomy occurred because the Enlightenment scientists, I could say, had good press. I mean, they could look back at something like the 30 Years' War, which devastated Europe, and say that destruction is the result of religion. It's the conflict between Protestants and Catholics that seems never to end. And the solution is to ignore religion and put our faith in science as a way to conquer and master the world and make life better. And that was a pivotal turning point. And it's the hope of my book to also contribute to undoing this false dichotomy between faith and science and religion.
Wonderful. Okay, so we can get some more needed background
Right.
for that. Yes. Let's see. Okay. All right. Well, I thank you so much. I think as we're thinking about this, in light of our audience, as you a few things stood out for me, right? That our vocation is, or our calling is, to spread the gospel, to
Mhm.
build up the kingdom of God in all that we do, and rejuvenating our culture.
Mhm.
And so, in what ways can we do that in our parishes, in our homes, in our families, right? In our
Mhm.
neighborhoods, and keeping that view of the incarnation, God coming to the world, and
Mhm.
then our role in that also.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
that we are in effect we're cooperators with the work done by Jesus in the incarnation,
Mhm,
and the church as the extension of Christ in time. As members of the church, that's what we do when we talk
mhm,
about evangelizing the culture. And you could tell that this is, I think people who are unfavorable to religion know this, because increasingly in a secularized society such as ours, there's pressure to push the gospel and the evangelical impulse to keep it contained within the four walls of the church. So you can go to mass, you can do it, you do what you do there, but don't bring it outside.
mhm,
And that pressure is exactly what Jesus said not to do. We have to
mhm,
bring it out into the world. That's what I think this incarnational humanism is so important. It's got this missionary impulse. It's that we are here to engage the world. Engagement, engagement, engagement. That's the key piece.
mhm. Wonderful. Well, many, many great things to think about and reflect on, especially as we are, just about ready to celebrate Christmas. So thank you so much for your time and sharing this with us. Um, is there anything else you would want to mention about the book?
No, as I said, I think it's my intent was to try to make a contribution to dissolve this opposition between two things that are both good, right? And
Mm,
that both came from the heart of the church. The science, technology comes from the heart of the church, but needs to be directed by gospel imperatives.
mhm. Wonderful. Thank you so much. As I mentioned earlier, this is the 7th book in the Reclaiming Catholic History series. So our offer to you today, our little gift to you, is 25% off any of these books when ordering at Ave Maria Press using the code webinar 1220 for today's date. So this is the last of our fall 22 webinar series. We will start fresh, start with our new series, our spring series come January. And I will send out a link tomorrow. If you do not get automatic email invites, you can sign up to receive those to get the webinar invites. Thank you everybody for joining us today. Dom, thank you so much for spending this
Thank you,
time with
Erin.
us and sharing your expertise. I wish all of you a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. We'll see you
Merry
in
Christmas,
January.
everyone.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much.
Okay, bye.